one of our readings this week, supplemental reading from the e-reserves is David Bentley Hart. It's a chapter from his book, Beauty of the Infinite. It's a really powerful book. He's Eastern Orthodox. I think he teaches in Virginia. Maybe the way to start it is this, and it's to just take this thought experiment and ask yourself, why is it that these knights used to, or presumably go and are willing to fight a dragon to save and marry a beautiful princess? The idea being that the reason that they do it, of course, is because of her beauty, right? The beauty is itself something so powerfully compelling that it might be a signal to us about what's true about God. And Hart's book, start to finish, is just an account of the fact that God's beauty and the nature of God as a triune creator spills over into the creation in so many different ways, so many different compelling ways, that if we attend to them and we recognize the beauty of the earth for what it is, the beauty of the cosmos for what it is, we're directed, our eyes are directed back to the Creator himself and his triune glory and beauty. God is light. Hart talks about Gregory of Nyssa, who recognizes the importance, and I think we actually read some of him later, the importance of the notion that God is the purest, most beautiful beauty that could ever be. And the creation, if we understand it right, we recognize that it is the overflow, the spilling over of the beauteousness of God, the beauty of God, and what we have here is it's God's thumbprint. So, despite the fact that there's problems here, despite that it's marred, sin and the fracturing of the universe has marred the created order, nevertheless, it is itself wholly from God and therefore beautiful, because God is beautiful. There's a couple of major points that Hart makes, and let me just preface you, if you haven't tried to read it yet, you'll quickly recognize that he's difficult to understand. He makes all kinds of crazy allusions, uses foreign languages from time to time, has an incredible vocabulary that's far beyond mere mortals, and yet you can hear and you can feel in the verve and the movement of his writing, he's testifying to something that that should grab us. It should be radical in the way that it draws our eyes to who God is. And so a couple of his major points. The first is that creation is pure gift. Hart recognizes that because God is triune and because God is Father, Son, and Spirit, that God is eternally in the process of self-giving, right? And so you can think of it in some of the ways that theology has talked about it in the past, and really drawing a lot on the language of the Gospel of John and the Johannine writings, is that the Father glorifies the Son, right? And then the Son, when lifted up at the cross, glorifies the Father in the power of the Spirit. There's this eternal cycling, this dispersal, this constant deferring of glory from Father to Son back in the power of the Spirit. That the Godhead is constantly self-emptying. And Hart draws on some of the theology of Eberhard Jungel, who is an interpreter of Karl Barth, whom we've talked about before. And one of the major keys there is that God is absolutely self-giving to the point of self-negation. I mean, you have to question what it means that the incarnate God was crucified, the incarnate God died. Jürgen Moltmann's The Crucified God, it's an unflinching look at trying to grapple with and recognize what it means that we confess that the second person of the Trinity came and was with us and was crucified, suffered and died. That God's self-emptying, that God's self-giving is so powerful, it's so profound, that God is willing to even be murdered at the hands of the creation. What that indicates to us is that God in God's self and God's own being is so incredibly self-giving, so incredibly self-deferring of glory, circling back and forth, well, I guess triangulating around and around and around. That it's interesting. Our creation, the created world that we're in, the cosmos that we're in, this world that we live in, is really just it's just God's pure gift. It's the kind of thing God does, as it were. There's nothing. One of the things Hart harps on quite a bit in this essay is he talks about the fact that the created order is not necessary, right? That before there was a creation, before there was a cosmos, it's not as though God was sitting there and God was lonely. That God was I wish I had someone to play with. I wish I had someone to talk to. That's not who God is. God is eternally full and self-sufficient in the Trinity, right? The Father, Son, and Spirit are utterly full, utterly loving, utterly gracious, utterly sufficient. There's just no need at all for this world that we live in. And yet it happened. It happened. It's here because it's the kind of God God is to give and to lavish and to speak out, to spill over. And what we call that overflowing goodness from God, we call that grace. Paul in Ephesians talks about the storehouses, the wealth, the immeasurable riches of grace that God has in both the first and second chapter of Ephesians. It's almost as if God is the storehouse of grace and just opens it up and lavishes it. It just trickles out. And the first thing that happens is the cosmos, the universe. The universe is the overflow of God's goodness. But then that's not enough. God then goes beyond and incarnates and gives himself in his incarnation to the world. There's nothing about us that deserves any of it. There's nothing about us that's necessary. It's not as though God had to do any of this. And yet it's because God's the kind of God God is that this all happens. The universe, the creation, is pure, unadulterated gift. It is gracious in the extreme. Moreover, you look around the universe, and the universe is this place of almost infinite variety. There's so many different stars, and you look at our planet, and there's just incredible wealth of life and vibrancy. It's bewildering. You couldn't imagine it. You couldn't imagine a place like this if you spent all of your time doing it. And yet we take it for granted because it's so present to us, because it is where we are, and it's where we've always been. Well, this God that we have is constantly being differentiated, right? We've talked about this before, where we have the Trinity. The Trinity is one being, one God, and yet God is also infinitely differentiated into Father and Son and Spirit. That God is being personed, is personhooding in eternity, and yet is constantly moving back to one. But there's this infinite differentiation. God is being within God's self. There's differentiation. Father, Son, and Spirit. They're different, and yet they're one. And one of the things we look out in the creation, we see this infinite variety, this constant difference. And we see this is the thumbprint of God. God's gracious overflow could only come in a place that's full and rich in variety, robust and vibrant and alive. And this too, when we approach it appropriately, and when we see it and when we're confronted by it, it's beautiful, it's compelling, it's worth fighting a dragon for. There's at one point Hart's quoting another theologian or talking about some of his work, Haman, I think, and says if we're getting to the heart of theology, if we're getting to the heart of the created order and what it's supposed to be like and how we're supposed to encounter it, we should be in a place of childlike wonder. It should be as if when we look at the world we live in, it is the same experience the first person who saw the Grand Canyon had. They're like, whoa, wow. And they look down in the Grand Canyon, and instantly the first thing you do then is look up. And just you're filled with awe and wonder and praise, because this beauty, it's so powerful, it's so compelling, it can only have come from beauty and truth and goodness itself, which Christians confess is the triune God. So that's kind of, look, if you're gonna categorize, or you're gonna try and get a handle on that essay, that's kind of it. Creation is pure gift. Creation is not necessary. It is simply the gift of God, and yet it's not surprising that a God like we have, a triune, self-differentiating, self-giving God, would do something so crazy as create a place like this. It's just who God is. And that is kind of a pointer. This place is a pointer back to that kind of God. If we see this place and we see what kind of place it is, we think and we recognize that, well, if that's the kind of God is, that those two things, he says there's an analogy of being. There's an analogy there. There's an impression that's left by this kind of God in a place like this, and the impression that the core, the essence of it, the basic, most important part of it, is that it's beautiful and that it is gracious. So gift and beauty. This is the first word in a doctrine of creation. Beautiful gift. I guess you should say the first two words. Beautiful gift.